My name is Zoe Flood. I am a journalist and a filmmaker. I'm not one of the student moderators, so just introducing myself briefly. I ran a production company in Nairobi for quite a long time, working with international media and connecting international media to local and regional talent. And I also co-produced, among other things, the first Zimbabwean feature film to be acquired by Netflix. So that's why I'm here. I'm thrilled to be moderating this panel. We have three incredible speakers who bring an amazing range of different experiences in this extraordinarily exciting part of the economy at the moment. It's exciting and it's complicated, and I look forward to digging into it. First of all, can we hear from Linda Ayola, who is head of music at Platoon, which is part of Apple, and works with emerging artists worldwide. So Linda, starting with you, and then I'll introduce Sheikh, who's joining us from Abidjan, and Victor, who is here as well. Could you explain a little bit about how Platoon operates in terms of supporting artist development across the continent, and particularly in terms of how you're developing infrastructure to ensure that artists can go on to build their creative world?
Well, that's a big question, and two parts, so keep me on track if I've digressed. And I'm also looking at the time because Zoe is also warned us, so I'm going to talk quite quickly, but if you need me to slow down, just let me know. So I'm Linda, as Zoe mentioned, I'm the global head of music at Platoon, which basically means that I decide what artists we work with, what artists we sign, and I've been doing that for the last 2 years. However, I was part of the founding team at Platoon in 2016, and we sold to Apple in 2018. Since then, I've been part of Apple and had various roles, not just on the continent, but also global roles. So to your question, Platoon is an independent label. And for those who aren't familiar with labels or music labels or whatnot, I'm just going to give you a very, very simple breakdown just so that everything else I say makes sense in all your other questions. So we sign artists. What does that mean? We distribute their music to the likes of Apple Music, Spotify, Tidal, etc., etc. You may know Universal, you may know Sony, you may know Warner. We're like that, but we're not a major label. All those three examples I mentioned are major labels. We're an independent label, which basically means that we allow our artists to keep their rights. We only license their music, so we can license their music for 2 years, 30 days, 5 years, 7 days, whatever it is, and we license their music, but they keep all of their masters and they keep all of their rights. And actually, that probably brings me down to the question that you asked, is we do that predominantly because we want to keep economic freedom in their hands. There's no reason why we should own their content. We're just borrowing it for a little bit of time whilst we help them market it and move it globally across the world. So that's what we do. And in terms of your second question, in terms of the infrastructure, so I want to boil this down to 3 parts. So especially not just for African artists, but for any artist. But I mean, Africa is close to my heart, so I might just use that example. I'm from Nigeria, so any Nigerians, hello. Yes, I love that. I love that. He's also Nigerian as well. So you've got a I'm sorry. I can see you. I don't know if you can see me, but hey. But essentially, there's 3 parts. So this is how Platoon and other platforms like Platoon are helping build infrastructure. We focus on artist developments. What that means is that those artists who are very early on in their career, we give them artist developments deals. So the likes of Iris Star is someone who I signed into Platoon. The likes of Amaray, I signed her as well. Santi, I signed that. So all these artists that you thought, oh, this just came out of the blue. No, there's something behind them like Platoon. And those are artists that, you know, near and dear to me. I still talk to them. I still love what they're doing. Many others. The first artist I signed was Mr. Easy, but Platoon and other independent platforms, we do writing camps, we do A&R mentorship. This is how we're trying to build the infrastructure, and we try and educate these artists so that they understand the business side of things. It's not just about putting out the content. How do they actually reap and gain in terms of their music? Another thing that we try and do in terms of infrastructure is that something the continent is struggling with is having suitable systems in place to collect royalties, publishing, anyone who understands that world, that needs to strengthen. And we're trying to build that in Africa. It's going to be a hard task. We're trying to partner up with people who are already doing a good job, people who are transparent, because that's also another thing. Transparency is something that you don't often find in certain places. I won't name names. And then another thing as well in terms of infrastructure is live. Live is super important to artists. You find on the continent there aren't as many medium-sized venues for artists to play, so that prevents them from actually gaining extra income, and these are things that will help the infrastructure of the business.
Thanks, Linda. That's fantastic. I'm going to move on to Victor, sort of to build onto that. Victor, you are an established multidisciplinary artist in your own right, and you are also building structures and systems to help support emerging artists, particularly in Lagos and Benin City. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about the tensions between both making sure that artists or creatives in any space can access global markets, but also remain protected, and that the value chain, where possible, remains on the continent. How are you also working to try and protect that and help that?
Thank you. I'm going to piggyback on her infrastructure, that we have a problem of infrastructure and expecting things to be done differently. And if we're going to play the game in global standard, we have to start building things ourselves. So in 2016, having lived in two worlds and know how the international market on visual art is a bit different from how side of like song and rights and all of that. But when you also come to art, there are multiple ways to splice that particular products, like, you know, even the rights to use the artist art on the cover of musicians, you know. So you create those things. I realized that there were places, there are artists, but there are no places to show things or even mentorship where they can come and have workshop, bring other people. I started the artist residency in Benin, in Lagos first in 2017. Which has grown to Benin City now, where we can host about 15 artists at the same time. And I also started a sculpture garden there, whereby artists that are working in medium of sculpture can then show their works. We have also started a festival, which is called the Black Muse Art Festival. So this brings everybody from all over the world to actually have a conversation and also then teach or learn. So it's the knowledge sharing is very important in infrastructure, you understand? It's not just physical infrastructure alone. What about, knowledge infrastructure, which we don't pay attention to on how to handle your work of art, which are more physical than ephemeral things in that sense.
Thank you, Victor. I think we come back to some of the mentorship and sort of supporting emerging artists. If we can go to Sheikh now in Abidjan. I hope you can hear us well from there.
I can hear you perfectly.
Wonderful. So when we spoke before the panel, Sheikh, just to give a little bit of background, because Sheikh is on the video screen, you're not seeing people's bios up there, is co-founder and managing partner of Rock Lane Capital Partners, has led transactions of more than 500 million since 2014, and is also founder and chair of Omega Sports Holdings, which is an investment firm focused on impactful platforms in the sports industry. So you're going to bring in some of the sporting side, but sport is also part of this wider kind of creative industries, creative economy. When we spoke before, Sheikh, you said to me that investing in these sectors 5 years ago was too early, 5 years from now is too late. The time is now. Why do you think that this is the moment for investing in these spaces on the continent? And how are you seeing that from the side of capital and finance?
Yeah, so as you know, when you speak specifically about sports, but to us, all of these are interlinked. Sports is really at the intersection of media, entertainment, technology, and infrastructure. And so, in this day and age, when you think about one of the only kind of media that people still want to consume live, I think sports is one of them. And then you also have media where people want to go to concerts, etc. And so when you think about, the demographics globally in a world where I think 30% is of the youth is going to be in Africa by the time we hit 2040. It means that we're in a very, very, very interesting place with Africa specifically, but also with sports. Everybody, I'm sure, every day hears and does something about artificial intelligence, but in the short term, I don't think we're going to be consuming sports by watching AI robots competing. Sports specifically kind of has this feel that brings emotions to people, whether it's countries, it's schools, its neighborhoods, its community. It brings a lot of people together. So in this fast changing world where white collar jobs are threatened, one of the places where I think it's not a threat is primarily in sports and to a second extent in media as well. And I think that's why 5 years ago AI was up and coming, but it was not there. And 5 years from now, the party will be over. So that's why part of the reason, at least, we decided to invest heavily in the sports, but everything around sports, including the infrastructure, the technology, and the entertainment component, because we think it's going to be a critical kind of component of how we live and how we consume media in the future. So that's how we set it up 4 years ago, and we invested across Africa and Europe. We have 4 portfolio companies. We have one. We have the largest basketball platform in Côte d'Ivoire. We have a stake in a basketball platform as well in France. We have a soccer academy and first division club in Côte d'Ivoire as well. And we have a stake in a company called Flex that actually does produce merchandise, sports merchandise for the business school at Oxford. And yeah, so we have a stake in that platform as well. So all of them being interlinked in kind of these interconnected ecosystem that we're trying to create.
Thank you, Sheikh. So I think everyone's fully aware of the amazing opportunities and potential in this space, and there are figures that have, that get bandied around that by 2030, the creative economies across the continent could be worth, I think, is it 200 billion by 2030? Yep, 200 billion by 2030. How is it possible, and we have talked about this already, but just to sort of elaborate on this, to ensure that the creatives themselves remain protected, particularly in terms of intellectual property, and particularly in terms of making sure that there are incomes and steady revenue? One of the things I've certainly seen is that there is incredible visibility, success stories, but also a lot of challenges when it comes down to individual creatives in sustaining their livelihoods. Victor, perhaps I could come to you first to talk about what you've seen in this space.
Well, I will speak specifically to the global numbers that just came out recently by UBS, looking at the art world. When I say art, I'm not going to be adding other things, just visual art, I would say. The global market rose 4%. It was down before, but now we have 59.6 billion industry. And the question is called world. How much of that is the Africa? Because if you look at the pie chart of that particular numbers, Africa is not showing up there. And we can speak about that whole 200 billion that you just spoke about just now, and we are still looking for being in that savior mentality. Meanwhile, we are living by the water and we are washing our hands with Spito. The thing is that we don't. The thing is that we are yet to look into the power of soft power in African art. Because a lot of the people, like people that work in the World Bank, you see art in your walls. I've been looking at artworks in the wall in Oxford today. But back home, how many people are actually collecting? I'm happy that one of my biggest collectors is in the audience today. But I have also grown with him in a journey. It's a particular journey. So for those that are looking back home, for those that we're not going to be able to tap in those figures. They are just going to be figures. They're just going to be smoke. Because we are not harnessing them. Again, I'm going back to to the idea of water. You have it flowing. If you don't dam it, you're not going to get energy from it. So if we are not paying attention to what is coming out of Africa, it's going to also look like an extractive industry whereby people come in, zoom in, drive by, take the resources, take the art, because we don't lack creativity in Africa. But how do you manage these things? How do you look at the infrastructure? Where are the people that are investing? We talk about money all day today, but how many people are going to go back and say we're going to invest in the value chain, right? Starting from galleries, starting from even acquiring the works and all of that, So we have to look at those things and figure out how we're going to create products that can harness those numbers. Otherwise, we'll be speaking 5 years from now, we're going to be quoting other numbers, and we're not going to be able to tap into that. So that is where I believe in building infrastructure. Like we have to build home, you understand? So my goal is to keep building and keep inviting people to look into those potentials, because that 59 billion, we should be able to harness some of that for Africans in the continent, in that sense.
Okay. And very much something that I've seen in the film space is that you may see these big initiatives from streaming platforms. How much is getting to the lighting technician on set in Zimbabwe and allowing them to develop their skills further, improve their kit, expand their horizons and their ambition, because ultimately you can do things on a real hustle, and we certainly did that on that film, but it's, you do need some capital to make these things happen. Perhaps on that note, just come back to Sheikh, and then I'll come back to you, Linda. Sheikh, where are you seeing interest from in terms of finance in the sort of emerging world of sport and entertainment? Is this traditional sources of finance? Is this diaspora finance? Is this private sector, philanthropic? Where do you think the richest seams are at the moment flowing into this space?
Interesting question. I think you're kind of seeing the transition right now, both from a global perspective and from I'd say an African perspective. I think on the sports side specifically, historically, sports team and a lot of these investments were owned by private capital, and we've seen over the last 10 years these being institutionalized quite heavily. And earlier this year, KKR bought into Arctos as a GP, and Arctos is probably one of the largest independent sports and media and entertainment focused firm. And KKR bought into that GP for about $1 billion, which is probably one of the largest transactions I've seen, at least over the last 10 years as it relates to private equity. So you're starting to see that shift where there's more and more capital being raised for institutional players, internationally and in the West. And I think you're starting to see the same thing in Africa as well. There's people like ourselves, the likes of Helios as well are investing heavily across the board in the space. And that's because I think historically people have not necessarily approached this space as any other industries, but really it's like any other industries where you have to build. It's about discipline, structure, business plan over the long term, controlling your cost to some extent, and also generating revenue, all the while creating a space for creativity and performance. So you're seeing this translation, and if I had to fast forward over the next 10 years, you would see that investing across sports, media, entertainment, will be very much mainstream. That's also why I think now is in a very interesting time to get in and occupy the space.
Coming back to Linda, what you were speaking about earlier, particularly in terms of rights and buying people's work for a period of time, essentially licensing it rather than seeking to own it. Mm-hmm. This seems both an area of high risk for young creatives or emerging creatives in terms of less ethical partners might not behave in that way. But then it's also an area of great power if people understand how to properly license their own IP. And how do you guys work with young artists, emerging artists, to ensure that people are protected in that way? And a sort of second question is about data. There is some platforms that are not particularly transparent about data, and that is a sort of a place of power, I think, for creatives, because they can show that their work has a large audience.
So you like two-pronged questions for me.
Rights and data.
Rights and data. How do we make sure that artists understand the rights? So Platoon, at its core, like, we're artists first. Sometimes we do deals that don't even benefit us. Like, I'll be fully transparent with you. And then sometimes we have artists on longer term deals, and maybe in mid-term, their contract, they want to leave. Technically they can't, but the way we set ourselves up, we're like, listen, we don't want you to stay anywhere that you don't want to be. We see ourselves as family. That's an extension of family. If you want to go, and we'll support you. This is an ethos which we hold till this day, even though we belong to Apple. So in answer to your question, how do we ensure that artists have this information, have that knowledge? To be honest, most artists that we take on, we ensure that they have a lawyer who acts in their best interest. Typically, when I liaise with lawyers, and I do that myself and people on my team as well, like, I want to know who that lawyer is. Like, if I've never worked with them before, I'm doing some research before I'm even asking the artist to sign that deal. And not because I owe it to the artist, this is a business after all, but I want to make sure that they have the knowledge before they enter into a long-term deal that they cannot get out of, right? So that's one thing that we do and we pride ourselves on. Typically, if the artist doesn't have a lawyer, doesn't have a manager, I'll be honest with you, we don't do the deal. We'd rather not do the deal. Unless the artists themselves are educated to that extent, perhaps they studied law or they understand more and they're well versed in that, we're just like, come back, we'll try and support you from the side, but we're not gonna, it just doesn't end well. I've seen that. Having worked with artists for the last 10 to 15 years, it just doesn't end well. I'd rather them have the education up front, and sometimes we lose out at the end. In terms of data and having that transparency, and there's some platforms that don't give this to artists. To be honest, I think sometimes this falls down to artists doing their homework and actually trying to gain access to that knowledge that's there. It may not often be accessible, but what I find is that when you're an artist, you often have people in your community who are also trying to be an artist. What I find sometimes is that artists don't truthfully talk to each other. So no, they don't. It's all about clout. It's all about, oh, how much money did you get from? It shouldn't be about that. It should be literally, I've got this contract. Like, I'm thinking about this. I have real conversations with people who are going through the same thing. And I kid you not, what you often find out is that, oh, this is how I did this differently, or this is where you can learn this. And so when it comes to access to information, it becomes more free-flowing. And when it comes to data from the likes of Apple Music, and I don't want to focus too much on Apple, even though that's where I'm from, but there's Apple Music for artists. You can log in, you can see what territories your music is being streamed. You can see that for yourself. Some artists, they don't want to do that. They want to rely on their manager to do that for them. Yes, the manager is there, but as an artist, this is your business. Like, and I think that they need to understand that. Artists need to understand that. Like, no one is going to want this more than you. And so you expecting your manager to do that and then to translate this information for you, cool on you. But if you want to get somewhere and if you want to take this globally, like, and I don't know if there's any artists in the room, but this is how I speak to artists. I'm like, you need to understand this information yourself. Get on the call. Understand, like, okay, how are they negotiating these deals? What is the data there? Okay, who did you just sign? Did you just sign Ira? What did you do for Ira? What can you do for me? We're making the same music. Like, this is all questions that you're entitled to ask as an artist, as a manager. And I do find that sometimes people are afraid to ask these questions due to maybe inexperience, due to maturity, due to just maybe like coming from a different side as opposed to, you know, us being in the Western world. But I'm always like, ask me. I'm an open book. I will tell you. Like, there's nothing that I'm hiding. And sometimes I point these artists to the direction of Spotify for artists, because evidently sometimes your people who are consuming your music may not necessarily consume it where you think they're consuming it. So your top country on Apple Music could be, or city, could be Lagos on Apple Music. But on Spotify or on Audiomack, it could be various different cities. So understand how that works so that when you want to do live performances, you have real people and you know where to really,
Plug in.
Yeah, plug in. Sorry, I'm super passionate, so I'm really sorry, yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And I thought it was really interesting your point about transparency between creatives. There was a panel earlier, and I heard the phrase, I think it was competitive jealousy, where it's rather than, it's about when resources are so limited, people can end up fighting for the pie rather than thinking how to build a bigger pie as a group of people.
Yeah.
And that is the way to sort of grow things as effectively as possible. Yeah. That also requires an audience and distribution channels. And Victor, you work in many different forms, primarily visual art, but I know that you're involved in, film exhibitions, but also you have a lot of contacts in the literary world, you write. There are a lot of questions and I know historic challenges around Pan-African and cross-border distribution. Yeah. So you end up often having to buy a book that maybe has been published in the UK rather than and it has to travel sort of a long way round to get back to another market on the continent. Are there any interesting examples that you've seen? I know that there's some innovative publishing houses in Nigeria that are challenging some of these assumptions around needing to sort of lean on traditional publishers, say, in the West.
Yeah, for the longest time, that is actually one of my background literature, and we've seen where there were no access to works that were written on the continent. You have to look to the West to buy them and all of that. And I would say about a decade plus now, there has been a democratization of publishing houses, especially in Nigeria, to be totally honest with you. You have Cassava, you have Farafina that was publishing before and all of that. And also because of how many successful writers that have come out from the continent and powerful enough to speak in rooms, like Linda said, to say, no, I'm not selling the rights. I'm not selling the African rights. I'm not selling the Nigerian rights to you guys. Hanema, you can take this, Harper, you can take this, but I'm going to publish with a local publisher. So that has kind of made books accessible to Nigerians and other West African countries in that sense. So recently now we have in Masobe, I'm publishing with them. They are local publisher. My book is coming out in August this year. Thank you. So they are publishing and they are really being gangster about the way they are doing things and they are publishing a lot, and a lot of the other publishers that have moved to West African, Nigerian publishers that have moved to the West are now publishing with them. So now there is that accessibility. One thing that I wanted to say earlier is that if you do it right, instead of wanting to go to the West will come to you. So you have to go and build something. We saw the Middle East, not because of the war, but recently their culture, Art Basel, all the art scene, all the museums, Guggenheim and all of that, they are licensed and all of those things. And we go there, you realize that they have been intentional about building this thing, and instead of them going to the West is coming to them. So if we build Africa like that, you understand, I know that there are issues with government not understanding, there are issues with policies and all of that, but individuals have to be intentional about it. You can't always have a problem and complain about it and not doing something about it. Yes, of course, we don't have government well-run museums, you don't have galleries and all of that, but we can't come and learn from here and say we have graduated from Said, we have graduated from the art school here, then you go back and still speaking grammar. No, it doesn't make sense. So you just have to do it.
I love it. I love it.
We're very sadly running short of time, so I'm just going to slip in two more questions, and I know that these guys who are here in the room would be happy to talk to people afterwards. They were sad that there wasn't time for an audience Q&A. But just coming to Sheikh, at the end of Victor's point, and if you could keep this short because you can't see the timer like we can, what would your two recommendations be for governments across the continent, from your perspective, of what they can do to help capital flow more freely and help these sectors' development? One or two suggestions.
I think starting point is infrastructure. Infrastructure is the bedrock of all of this. So you need to have, and it's the full value chain of infrastructure from the final venues where you could have events, sporting events, entertainment events, etc., to where you started. So whether it's the training schools and these grounds and the playgrounds, etc. So I think infrastructure is one, and then two, investing as well in harboring and creating these forums where investors can come and experience it, and making it easy for them to invest. And you can do that via all kinds of incentives for people that come and invest in the space. So those are maybe the two things that I think the government can do from its perspective.
Brilliant. And to finish with you, Linda, if you were not, say, speaking to creative artists, but you were speaking to a room of MBA students who may want to work in the creative industries across the continent, what would you suggest would be sort of the most useful things that people looking at building businesses or coming up with business ideas could do to support this ecosystem?
I think that's a great question. I think about this often because I'm like, oh, how can I build a business and make the opportunity? But I think it boils down to what Shakespeare said in terms of infrastructure. So where are the gaps? So right now, I talk about rights and I talk about collecting royalties. I talk about things like that. That's still such a massive, 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 massive gap in Africa. I'm trying to understand it in my head so that I can understand what is it I can do to take advantage. Like I often think about legacy. Yes, this is where I work at the moment, but like what can I take from my industry and bring it back home and help create the system so that not only that people can exploit it, or when I mean exploit, I mean it in a good way. Like ourselves, the artists, how can they exploit it so that, yes, their music can travel globally, but how can that actually mean money in their hands? Because right now, like the problem isn't talent. This is what you said, it's not talent. It's like, how do you create these steady jobs? And you create it by creating systems. So like, if I were you and an MBA student, I'd be thinking about what systems can I create to help these artists, not just musicians, but also visual artists. Like how could I create these systems to allow them to exploit wealth? Because ultimately, that's what people want. Like, let's call a spade a spade. Like, how is it that we put the power back into the artist's hands? Is by creating wealth so that they can pay it forward, and people can understand that this is a job that they can also do. If you do this job and you're not getting paid, why would anyone want to be doing that? Like, why would you want to be doing that? So you have to be a good example. How can we be a good example? Is by creating the systems to allow people like Victor to do that. So yeah, for sure, think about the systems, I would say.
Thank you so much for this incredible panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your attention and
I've learned
energy.
so much.
And do keep talking about such an important area, and I hope there's tons of ideas and innovation coming out of this room as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.